I need to have tea for this episode because what I'm going to tell you is going to be so exciting and earth-shattering. It's an unbelievable discovery. So let's get into it. There is human history, which stretches far into the past, tens and hundreds of thousands of years. But there is only one event in human history that stands out as being more important than anything else that ever happened. That event changed not just the history of music, it changed everything. And the man behind this event is, of course, a world historical genius. His name is Wim Winters. And the way Wim changed the world is that he said, look, all of the great Western art music, classical music masterpieces need to be played twice slower. So that during a performance of a Beethoven sonata, you should be able to have lunch, to have dinner, to go for a walk, to come back, to have a nap. The sonata will still be carrying on and on and on and on and on. And that's how you have to play everything. Everything has to be, according to Wim's double beat theory, twice slower. And it's clear that he is a genius. I'm going to talk about his unsurpassed genius in this video. So I was thinking to do either a definitive video to have a casual conversation with you, and I'm going to have the latter. And so we're going to do this video, and I want you to stay with me, in one take. And it's going to be less conclusive, less definitive, an exploration of this extraordinary nuttiness and phenomena. But nevertheless, it might be more curiosity-inducing and might inspire us to have more of a conversation about it. So let's get into it. There is one way in which you can attack the problem. The problem that there is somebody there who says something completely eccentric and nutty that nobody serious could take seriously. You could attack that problem by engaging that nutty person on their own terms. And that's exactly what I'm not going to do. And I'm not going to do it for a couple of reasons. The first reason I'm not going to do it is that there is a man out there called Patrick Emmerle who has already done enough to refute Wim Winters' theories on their own terms. And I'm not going to do it because he has done it. But there is a second reason why I'm not going to do it. And that's that when somebody tells me that the earth is flat, I don't disprove them on their own terms. I don't walk with them to the edge of the world and check. When somebody tells me that human pain is not real because they have some kind of special spiritual belief of that kind, I don't get out my needles and start prodding them and see how they react. Why not? I don't do it because the person who thinks pain isn't real, the person who thinks the earth is flat, the person who thinks that you should play a Mozart sonata at twice slower tempo, doesn't have a misconception about the nature of the earth, the nature of human pain, the nature of musical tempo. What they're misconceiving instead lies in a different place. They're misconceiving the difference between illusion and reality. And of course, here we're in the realm of the banal. Alfred Brendel, the greatest living musician, once asked his dearest friend Isaiah Berlin, Isaiah, what's the most universal human value that you can think of? And Isaiah said, it's resilience. And the reason Isaiah said it was resilience is because resilience is genuinely a terribly universal human value. But he said resilience because he was giving a positive answer. He was thinking of positive human values. But what if we think about negative values and negative human capabilities? I think that the most universal value of that negative kind might be our extraordinary propensity for self-deception. So we're not talking about anything unusual. But if we aren't to go about disproving Wim on his own terms, by pointing to documents of performances, pointing to correspondences, pointing to inconsistencies, pointing to his lack of any remotely plausible evidence for his case. If we're not going to do any of that, which we're not going to do, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to have a more general conversation about the exact nature of Wim's era. And we might say at the end, depending on how we do, why people like his stuff. And why people are attracted to what he's doing. But let's start with the basics. The problem with Wim is not that he is making an error in tempo research. The problem is that there ain't no such thing as tempo research. Any more than there is any such thing as, this is going to be a bad analogy, but we're doing this in one go, so we'll stick with it. Any more than there is such a thing as bishop research in chess. And you're not going to do bishop research because what a bishop does is connected to what every other piece on the board does. You can't isolate tempo from every other musical element and research it. The tempo that's correct, the tempo that's intended by the composer, is a product of everything that the piece is and everything that the composer asks in the piece. I think we should say more about that in a second. But there's only one place to start, and that's that Wim's ideas that you can discover the correct tempo of a piece by doing research. That idea misconceives the most basic fact about Western art music, and that's that Western art music gives us two things: a conception of a piece and then its realization in sound. And the way Western art music gives the two to us means that they can't be reduced to one another, not even in principle, not even in some kind of ideal world. The conception on the page always needs to be interpreted. There is no way we could discover how it should be played. That discovery will only be a discovery, if you like, that occurs in the course of an interpretation. But it won't be a discovery of the only way to play the piece. It'll be a discovery of one way to play the piece among others. Now, the piece will have a definite personality. The piece will have definite borders, but it can be realized in multiple ways. This is what Artur Schnabel said when he remarked of the great Central European masterpieces, that they were pieces of music greater than they can be played. He meant that they can be multiply realized. Now, the term that a lot of folks in musicology and in the philosophy of music, which is a curious subject we'll talk about another time on this channel, what a lot of these folks say about this gap between conception and its realization in sound is that the conception underdetermines its realization in sound. The piece underdetermines a performance of it. And that's not the worst thing to say in the world, but I prefer to put it differently. I prefer to say that the piece over-determines performance, and that's actually closer to what Artur Schnabel meant. Because what happens when you open a score of a Beethoven sonata, it's not that you feel, oh, okay, Beethoven has given me this, and then over and above that, I can build whatever I like. No. Rather, your experience of a close understanding of a score is that you're pulled in so many different directions. He asks you to do 27 things, but some of them are incombinable, so you can only do 18 of them. And so the rest are going to have to sort of drop off. And of course, in a great performance, they're going to have to drop off while leaving everybody with the impression that nothing has dropped off at all and that this was the only way to do it. Now, again, let's be clear. When I'm saying that there is this kind of multiple realizability, I'm not saying that the piece isn't already definitely on the page. I'm not saying that the interpretation is subjective. I'm just saying that you are interpreting the piece within borders of a certain kind, but then within these borders there is going to be a series of incompatible but terribly attractive possibilities. You're going to have to figure out how you're pulled between them and arrive somewhere. It's a little bit like telling a story about a person. And of course, character role play is a very central aspect of music making. It's just as central in practical music making as it is in acting. So it might be that I have this beautiful friend and I can tell you a story about my friend, but that friend has another friend who can also tell a story about that friend. Now, our stories will be different, but both will be nevertheless faithful to some core parameters, to some core qualities, to some borders within which the personality of that friend exists. So there is this gap. And because this gap is there, the only way we could discover what the tempo is at which a piece should be played is by interpreting the piece and by making sense of everything in the piece, every bit of the structural qualities of the piece, every bit of the musical process, every bit of character in the piece. And when we figure all of it out and put it all together, then a particular tempo recommends itself. And depending on who the composer is, we're going to have to attend very closely when we arrive at a tempo on the basis of taking everything on board. We're going to have to attend very closely, but not as closely each time, depending on who the composer is, to the tempo indication the composer gives, if they've given us one. But that's not to say that we have to follow it in a completely rigorous way. I mean, that will often leave us in strife. So we're of course not naming something that we absolutely need to name in this conversation, and that's the period music movement. Now, of course, my personal view about the period music movement is that it did a lot of good and continues to do a lot of good, particularly now when period ideas have come together with the more conventional ideas, and there is a potential for a wonderful interaction between different ideas. But nevertheless, there are enclaves in our culture, and they used to be less moderate than they are now a few years back, where we've got some slightly crazy period ideas. And what do these ideas say? What these ideas say is that you can get rid of the basic distinction between conception and realization. Because they say that it's not interpretation that we need, actually, but research. Now, it might not be the kind of research that we can realistically accomplish successfully, but it sort of is doable in principle, if not in practice. In other words, if we research sufficiently well the instruments of Mozart's time, if we research sufficiently well the performance practices of Mozart's time, if we reconstruct sufficiently well what instruments and sounds Mozart may have had in his head, then we're going to be able to figure out how to play a Mozart symphony. That's a way of reducing interpretation to a research program. And of course, no wonder that period ideas, particularly in their most extreme forms, have proved successful in academia, because of course you are replacing interpretation with a research program. But you can't research your way to the correct way to play a Mozart symphony. You're going to need to interpret it. Moreover, the sounds available to Mozart aren't going to give you the result you want. Because of course it's naive to think that composers compose for the instruments available at the time when they're alive. In fact, very often if a composition is a masterpiece, it's written for instruments that don't yet exist. So the gap between conception and realization means that there is going to be no such thing as researching the way you should play something. And it's also a fundamental truth about Western art music that tempo is going to be the correct tempo for a performance is going to be a byproduct of a cumulative understanding of every aspect of a piece. So, as I've got the score for the Hammerklavier Sonata opus 106, let's have a look at it. Now, this is an example that Wim has talked about on his channel, and I'm going to link up a performance by a young colleague of Wim's, which completes the reading of the Hammerklavier Sonata in 744 trillion hours. So, in fact, I'm sure he's still playing it, having begun last year. This sonata is indeed not playable at the tempo at which Beethoven indicated. Now, that doesn't mean you couldn't sort of kind of get through the score at that tempo. It rather means that you can't do everything Beethoven asks. What you want to do here is engage in an extraordinary act of cumulative propulsion. But that propulsion has to take every level of musical process with it and be extremely controlled. If it's not controlled, if it's jagged, if it's wobbly, the effect will not work. As far as I can remember, the fastest reading of the Hammerklavier is by Artur Schnabel, and he sounds, when he reads it, like the man running for the bass, carrying his shopping is falling out of his shopping bags. It's a mess. And Schnabel's still probably over 5% below the tempo indication Beethoven gives. My beloved Paul Skoda recommended at least a reduction of 10 to 15%, and that for me is the fastest conceivable approach to the Sonata Opus 106. There is, of course, another conversation. It's coming up shortly on this channel. And that's a conversation about an issue at the beginning of the Hammerklavier, about whether you distribute the opening jump between two hands, whether you play it with one hand, or whether you do one of two further things. So there are actually 4 options about how to handle this jump. And this jump is all about how you comply with the fast trajectory of the piece while keeping control of it. That's going to be a separate episode coming up very soon. So indeed, you can't play this piece as fast as the tempo indication suggests. But while you're looking for a reduction, too much of a reduction, and we're not talking about Wim's level of reduction, we're talking about something much more speedy. But a reduction that's far, far below what Beethoven wants will yield a sort of magisterial effect, like you're getting columns, you're getting a military parade marching. That's the last thing you want. This is a revolutionary piece of extraordinary energy. So you can't make it sound magisterial. And of course, it sounds magisterial and is too slow if you play it much faster than Wim's friend plays it. That's a performance that, again, I'll link up below. And of course, I still suspect it's a performance that is still going on. What's my arrogance here, by the way, when I overrule Beethoven? Well, I'm actually not overruling him, because I'm responding to 100 different things he's asking, and only one of them is the indicated tempo indication. So I'm putting together everything he asks, acknowledging that not everything he asks can sit together, and I am prioritizing, about how do we realize the most important things asked for in this score with the least possible compromise. And there's of course something else that's really important, and that's that composers typically worked fast, like really fast. And this is one of the big differences between music and, for instance, literature. It's almost sickly, actually, how fast a Beethoven or Mozart or Schubert could work. It's really disturbing. And so if you are Alfred Brendel, what happens is that across decades of you thinking about the Hammerklavier Sonata, you're going to spend more time thinking about the piece than the composer by far, like to the power of 100. And so absolutely you're going to know the piece in many ways much better than the composer themselves did, or at least better than the composer themselves consciously did. So this is an indirect sort of capturing of the craziness that's going on with Wim Winters. But we need to land this video by saying some positive things. Why do people feel attracted to Wim's content? I mean, there are some superficial things to say here that shouldn't be underestimated. Wim's videos are aesthetically beautiful. They're some of the most beautifully shot keyboard playing anywhere on the internet. They are beautifully visually produced videos. Also, Wim is very good at cultivating a sense of I said cultivating, maybe I should have just said cult. Wim is very good at cultivating a sense of community by banning, anyway, we're not going to talk about that. But of course, there is a real thing worth saying that's a musical explanation of why people like what they're getting with Wim. And that's that an appreciation of a great musical masterpiece is not an either-or thing, it's a matter of degree. So if I take a fantastic keyboard instrument, a wonderful, late 1800s Bechstein, and I ask a hippo to interact with it, that won't give us enough to enjoy anything. I mean, for one, we won't recognize any particular piece of music there because the hippo will just probably smash the piano. But at what point can we say that we're getting at least something of the piece that's being performed? Would we be moved if a sort of 1.5-year-old tried their hand at playing a Mozart sonata? No. But you don't have to get that far to begin to be moved. I mean, you look at the performances that look to many people unethical because he shouldn't be on the stage, of David Helfgott. Their performance is devoid of any executive or psychological control. People have liked them and followed them, and that's not just because of the idea of a person with a huge mental health challenge being on stage. No, it's because when you give somebody 8% of a Mozart sonata, they kind of like it. Just like if you give somebody 8% of a really good meal, especially if they don't know what that meal is when it's properly presented, they're going to say, well, this is very nice. If somebody has never tried ice cream in their life and you give them a pretty shoddy ice cream, they might say, well, this is pretty interesting, it's quite tasty. So when Wim plays Mozart sonata at an unbelievably slow tempo for his audience, they kind of like it. They hear some things. They don't hear many of the things they need to hear that the composer demanded. They don't hear the masterpiece in its full glory. But they're getting, 12% of it, 15% of it. And that's something. They're appreciating also, of course, the beauty of sound of the instruments. And this is a part of it too, the sort of fetishization of a particular beautiful sound. And, they're getting some of the melody of the piece. They might not get any of the character of the piece. That's mostly going to be dead in the Wim Winters reading. They might not understand much about the rhythmical or harmonic progression of the piece. Might understand some things, but they're going to get this kind of limited dose. And if you don't know what it's like to have the full thing, or to get close to the full thing, you could enjoy this. And so this is actually the main aesthetic explanation of why people like this sort of stuff. Because when you give people 20% of a Mozart sonata, they're going to like it. In fact, when you give people 68% of a Mozart sonata, they might not be able to hear it. They might not be able to recognize it. It takes not just experience, but also musical talent to appreciate these masterpieces. So that's why people like Wim's stuff. This was a little bit of a rant that nevertheless touched on some of the important aspects that we needed to cover to begin coming to terms with the great genius Wim Winters. Now, if you have come across Wim's stuff, tell me what you think about our discussion here below. And if you haven't, tell me anything about anything. Tell me how you are, tell me what you thought of this video. We're going to have a lot of Western art music content coming on this channel soon. Stay safe and take care till then. I'll meet you in the comments below.